I've seen so many businesses over the years where people spend an inordinate amount of time developing their product with minimal, if no feedback, or bad feedback, if you will. They're getting their families and friends to say they love it. And they're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to develop this. And then they launch it to the market and the market says, no, we don't want it.
Welcome to today's episode, where we delve into the transformative concept of the minimum viable product, or MVP, a cornerstone of the lean startup methodology. Today, we'll explore how launching with an MVP can dramatically streamline the development process, minimize risks, and enable entrepreneurs to learn directly from their target audience early on.
The Let's Get Entrepreneurial podcast is your ultimate launchpad for igniting ideas and skyrocketing your entrepreneurial dreams. Your two hosts will be Professor Gary Palin and serial entrepreneur Ryan Budden.
Hello, Ryan. How are you doing today?
I'm doing brilliantly. What about you, Professor Palin?
Doing okay. You have your cup of coffee? You haven't spilled any on yourself yet?
My wife says it's inevitable that I will, so let's not hold our breath.
Today, I want to talk about a concept called minimum viable product, and mainly we'll refer to it as MVP, which is how it's commonly referred to. What it is developing a business product. It's the simplest version of a product that can be released to test a new business idea. And the key characteristics that you want in an MVP is you want enough features to satisfy early adopters. And also there's an ability for them to provide feedback for you for future development as you're expanding the features, et cetera, of the product.
Absolutely. I just like to think of it as the smallest thing that you could possibly sell to somebody. No frills, no fluff, just the most condensed version of that.
I've seen so many businesses over the years where people spend an inordinate amount of time developing their product with minimal, if no feedback, or bad feedback, if you will. They're getting their families and friends to say they love it. And they're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to develop this. And then they launch it to the market and the market says, no, we don't want it. It's a waste of time. Whereas MVP is you going in small iterative stages, continually getting feedback from the market, developing more.
I deal with this a lot in my consulting startup technology companies, because people have a tendency to want to overdevelop. They want to push out this incredibly shiny, finished product before they even know if people are going to like using it. What I often find is if you go with the MVP route, you actually do end up with a product that people are going to use. When I get brought onto projects that are a little bit more mature, so many times I find that their dominant feature, what brings people to their product, is not what they initially set out to use it as. It was a sub feature or something that they added on as a nice to have. And they could have found that out a lot earlier and saved a lot of time and money in development if they had gone the MVP route.
That goes into planning an MVP. You want to identify core features that solve a primary problem of your target market. And you want to make distinction of must have versus nice to have features. And as you just mentioned, you may be wrong. And the MVP will tell you that you've missed something, or something that you thought was a minor issue turns out to be the key factor.
And the other thing I find is you will build a long, nice to have list by getting customer feedback. And a lot of times that nice to have list can really inform the direction of the product.
Anyone that's out there contemplating a business or starting a business that hasn't talked to multiple potential customers or existing customers is making a mistake.
Without a doubt. And your cousin, your mother, your best friend are not potential customers. We all fall into the trap of getting them as initial feedback. I still do it to this day. I ask my friends what they think about things, but that's just the very initial gut reaction. You've got to go talk to somebody that is actually in a position to buy what you're selling, a true customer.
To build the MVP, there are a few areas that I think in terms of sequential steps that you take that you want to make sure you address these. I believe you should leverage existing tools and platforms. If you can, do not create something proprietary. Use something off the shelf. Even if down the road you have to create a proprietary.
Don't reinvent the wheel. How many times have you heard that saying? And it's so prevalent for a reason. If you can scale up quickly and cost effectively by leveraging open source technology or even closed source, something that there's a paywall behind, but you're able to leverage that to get you farther down the road, I would always recommend doing it. There are a few instances in which I wouldn't, but that's for another podcast episode.
And now another area with building the MVP is we've done a whole podcast episode about agile development practices. But that's something that you want to use those type of agile methods when you're developing the initial stages of your MVP.
And that's the bulk of my consultancy, is using the agile framework and agile methodologies. That's where I have all of my certifications. Essentially, to break it down to its most simple part, you're working in iterative sprints. Instead of saying, we are going to develop a product, right? It's don't have a product to we are shipping the product or putting it on the app store. And you're breaking it down into phases. Most agile teams work in what are called 2-week sprints. Every 2 weeks, you're reflecting on the previous 2 weeks and you're planning for the next 2 weeks. That approach can be taken into any form of business, and it's really effective, especially if you're working in teams.
Now, I did mention focusing on core functionality when I was just introducing the concept, but there are sometimes you have to implement non-core elements in your MVP just for functionality. And if you can, I would suggest outsourcing those non-core elements.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of framing it. The non-core elements, things that don't quite make it to the nice to have, but are basic functionalities to allow you to even get going.
Yeah, and with that, you can build a minimum feature set, and it should be the smallest feature set possible to engage the users. And within that, you have to develop a feedback loop.
How are you collecting that feedback? Who is it coming from? How are you monitoring it? What lists or data are you pulling from that feedback? Another pitfall that I frequently find with startups is they have tons of feedback. They've got emails that come in. They've got a phone number that collects voicemails. They've got a drop form on their website, but they're not really doing anything with it. They're not categorizing it or making a list that they can implement anything with. It's just sitting in the ether that they've established around them.
It is a gold mine of data there that they're not using.
Correct. And it can become very overwhelming very quickly if you don't have a methodology to go through it.
Ryan, before we continue, I'd like to address an important issue for the Let's Get Entrepreneurial podcast. Creating a quality podcast with valuable content is very time consuming and has substantial costs to create and produce. To cover these costs, many podcasts use a paid subscription model. Others use a sponsorship model. We prefer not to implement either of these options. I would like to address a concept called value for value podcasting.
While we enjoy creating value for our listeners, providing insights that enhance their entrepreneurial success, it would mean the world to us if our audience would also give some value back to us to support our efforts.
One might wonder, how can you support our show? Well, it's simple. Sharing our podcast with friends, colleagues, or on your social media is a fantastic way to give back.
Also, we love receiving your feedback, comments, or even just a cheerful email.
Or consider making a monetary contribution through platforms such as Venmo or Substack.
You can also support us by setting up a bill payment through your bank. This method allows you to send a contribution directly to our physical address.
Every bit of support counts, whether it's tuning in, sharing our episodes, or contributing financially. Each contribution helps us cover production costs and improve the podcast.
Check out our website at prospirit.com, where you can find more details on how to support us. Every contribution, no matter the size, makes a massive difference. Decide for yourself, what is the value of this episode to you? Let's do this together. We provide value and you return value. Value for value podcasting.
Thank you for being a part of Let's Get Entrepreneurial. Now, let's get back to today's episode. Now, once the MVP is built, at least version 1, because hopefully there will be version 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But once you have version 1, the launch, I think of in 3 steps. Your launch strategy, so you're choosing the right channels, marketing strategies to reach the early adopters is the first. And the second is what we've just finishing speaking about, gathering your feedback is your second step. And the third step is iterate. In other words, wash and repeat, wash and repeat. Go back, evaluate, go back to the development, and then launch version 2.
Something has struck me that I really like to frame for people. So these early adopters, a lot of times that's a stress point for businesses that are running MVP models. How do you get in contact with those early adopters? My thought is treat them like they're super special people, because they are. And if you form a really in-depth relationship with them and show how much you're valuing their use of the product and their feedback of the product, you'll probably move them from an early adopter to a lifelong customer. So many times that relationship isn't cherished enough. And I feel like it disintegrates because an MVP, you're going to have problems. I've never worked on a true MVP, like a real MVP that doesn't have issues. So you have to develop this rapport where there's some understanding and then some feedback of, we heard you say this, we are now doing this. And that brings us to the iterative approach.
If you don't have problems or chinks in the armor in your MVP, you probably have developed it too deeply and you've waited too long to launch. Is that old saying, we've talked about this previously, when you go back and you look at your first version of the product, if you're not embarrassed by that first version, you waited too long.
Oh, without a doubt. I can't tell you how true that has been for me. Some products I've pushed out that are successful. We had an exit on one of them. The first one worked. And for those of you listening, I'm doing air quotes around work. It was smoke and mirrors to get it to that point. We got the feedback that we needed and we developed a really awesome product around it.
The concept you mentioned about early adopters, you can get them deeply embedded in the development of the product. And you're right. They become your customers because they feel ownership in the product.
Right. And that's super important.
A few case studies, if people are having a hard time envisioning this, that I think are interesting is Zappos is one I think of. Their MVP approach was setting up a simple website with pictures of shoes from a local shoe store. They had no inventory. Once a shoe was ordered online, they'd go to the shoe store, purchase it, and ship it out. That was their MVP.
Amazing. And now how many millions of pairs of shoes do they sell probably weekly?
They were testing it. It made perfect sense. And what was the cost of doing that? Virtually nothing.
Right.
Another one I think is interesting is Airbnb. The original principals, they rented out air mattresses in their apartment to conference attendees in San Francisco to see if there was a viable concept. What are your thoughts with your experience with MVPs? What lessons learned have you come across?
I have a lot of experience with it. It's my preferred business model to execute. And that's because of the overdevelopment problem, especially in technology, but it goes into every business. You put so much time and effort into getting across this imaginary finish line, only to realize there's another finish line and another finish line and another finish line and another finish line. My biggest takeaway for it, and this might be a little bit jaded because again, the bulk of my consulting is through the agile methodology, is to shorten those finish lines. I always use a 2-week cycle. Every 2 weeks, how are you changing the product that you're putting out? What are the incremental steps? And 2 weeks is not a lot of time. So these steps are very small and very measurable. That not only engages customers, but it allows you to pivot. So we've talked about pivoting a lot on this podcast. So you can shift very quickly based on feedback. It allows you to reflect consistently. Because as another thing we've talked about a lot on this podcast is looking backwards and taking a second to pause and see what's going well can really help the success of a business.
And that description that you just gave follows along with the advice about iterate. There should be an iterative process that you continually review. And as you said, you like to shorten it to 2 weeks.
So every month you're changing, you're releasing 2 things. It's not only 2 things that you're changing, but you're having 2 releases.
I always think in terms of other lessons learned, and it follows with our advice with overcomplicating the MVP, ignoring feedback, ignoring research, et cetera, but also inadequate planning for the iterations and the launch of the MVP. I see as a big lesson learned. I see people making that mistake.
That's a big pitfall that is easily avoidable, but is easy to get trapped into.
So as we wrap up, any final thoughts on MVP?
Give it a try. If this isn't something you're used to, or maybe you have an idea floating around, think about what this minimum viable product, the smallest, most condensed version of that idea or the next thing you're doing in your business could be.
And I would suggest anyone that wants to go on this journey and try it out, as he suggested, they bring 2 things with them. One is a mindset of learning, and the second is flexibility.
I think that's a good thing for your life, not only for the MVP model.
I have to remember that. Well, let's get entrepreneurial.
Let's get entrepreneurial.
We extend our gratitude for your presence and attention. Check out profspirit.com to discover resources and courses designed specifically for innovators like you. Stay on the cutting edge by following us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, and other platforms as it is released. Until then, keep the entrepreneurial flame burning.